Hi, my name's Oliver, and today in Lab 2 I'll be discussing the characteristics of bipolar junction transistors. In this experiment, students investigate the characteristics of a bipolar transistor. This involved using software to produce a set of collector characteristics and draw a load line, allowing a Q point to be identified. Additionally, a frequency response was analysed, allowing students to evaluate the effectiveness of voltage gains at various frequencies. In the bigger picture, students were essentially able to understand how an ideal BJT amplifier operates and its real-world applications. A bipolar junction transistor, otherwise known as a BJT, is a circuit element consisting of a semiconductor doped with small amounts of impurities to form two PN junctions. This creates what is known as a PNP or NPN configuration. In this experiment, the much more common NPN configuration will be utilised, whereby the base emitter junction is forward biased, whilst the collector base junction is reverse biased. So essentially, how a BJT works is a current flowing into the emitter-collector circuit gets controlled by a significantly smaller current flowing into the base. And pretty much what happens is any small changes in the base current creates extreme changes in the collector current, allowing signal amplification to be achieved. So, when a BJT is configured in a typical common emitter form, the collector currents can be plotted as a function of collector emitter voltage, VCE. By incrementally increasing the base current, a set of collector characteristics can be produced, from which they can be observed to flatten out as they transition from the saturation region to the active region. Now, the voltage gain, beta, is defined as the change in character current divided by the change in base current. In other words, we can plot IC against each respective base current and calculate the gradient in order to figure out what the voltage gain of a BJT is. This red load line can be constructed using the known circuit parameters and is given by equation 1, from which a Q point can be identified. This point essentially tells us the operating point of the transistor within the active region. If this point was in the saturation region, a portion of the character current will be clipped, resulting in poor amplification of current. From this equation, we can see that as RB changes, our Q point will also change as it moves along the load line. Also, it's important to note that capacitors are highly effective at blocking DC and therefore allow a signal to pass without interfering with the DC bias of a transistor. Therefore, by adding a capacitor at each terminal, the desired AC signal is able to pass whilst the unwanted DC signal is regulated. The coupling of these capacitors is therefore highly effective whilst adjusting the level of base current. First, the provided oscilloscope data was imported and each respective channel 2 voltage was divided by 100 ohms to convert it into currents. The voltage and currents columns were then imported into MATLAB in the form of cell arrays. Using a for loop, the mean and standard deviation functions were applied to each block of currents per unit voltage. Before plotting the result, every third data point was selected in order to make the data easier to visualize and less cluttered. The plotting function was finally used to produce the collector characteristics, and this process was repeated for all 5 base currents. IC was then plotted against the base current and the resulting gradient was used to determine the current gain of the BJT. The associated uncertainty was obtained using the built-in Linus function in Excel. In part B of the experiment, a load line was constructed by inputting a linear line connecting points on the axis where IC equals to 0 and VCE equals 0. This line was constructed on the collector characteristic plot, allowing the points of intersection to be visualized and the Q point to be identified. For lower base currents, the collector characteristics were extrapolated beyond the load line. This process was repeated for when IB equals 0 ohms and 680 ohms. In part C, the trans characteristics were analysed by first plotting the channel 1 and channel 2 voltages against time. Then, the average amplitude of output voltage was divided by the average amplitude of input voltage, which provided the voltage gain for a given frequency. This process was repeated for all 13 frequencies given in the dataset. Then, the 13 voltage gains were plotted as a function of the logarithmic frequency ranging from 100 to 1,000,000 Hz of the input signal. This graph enabled the frequency response of the circuit to be visualized. Finally, the bandwidth could then be determined by observing the frequencies of constant efficient voltage gain. So here are the resultant 5 sets of collector characteristics obtained by incrementally varying the base current. As theoretically predicted, the average current is lower for smaller base currents and increases as the base current rises. Furthermore, all 5 collector characteristics reach a certain point before beginning to flat out beyond the saturation point. The nearly flat saturation region has a slightly positive non-zero gradient. This is actually because as VCE increases, so does the depletion region inside the BJT. This causes the effective base width to reduce, allowing more electrons to jump across the PN junction. It's important to note that the curves within the saturation region are not perfectly parallel to one another, indicating that there is some source of error in the experiment. An example of this may be due to the minor temperature fluctuations occurring throughout the measurement taking, affecting circuit apparatus. This element of uncertainty can be further visualized after plotting IC against the base current and observing that it is not perfectly linear. The voltage gain given by the gradient was found to be 500.17 with an associated uncertainty of 59.61. The load line was obtained by constructing a line in the form of y is equal to mx plus b, which intercepted the y-axis at 0.015 amps and the x-axis at 15 volts. The 10, 15 and 20 microamp base currents were then extrapolated such that they extended long enough to intercept the load line from which a point of intersection could then be obtained. The Q point was found to be at approximately 7.27 volts and 0.0077 amps. So here is a comparison between the voltage gain of a circuit with an RB resistance of 680 kiloohms and no RB resistance. On the left, we observe a significant voltage gain between the input and output amplitudes, whereas with the case of zero resistance, an extreme amount of distortion is evident with these blue dots scattering. This makes sense since at tiny resistances, we begin to leave the active region and enter the saturation region. This results in the character current being clipped, resulting in poor voltage gain and lots of disturbance. The frequency response of this circuit reveals a relatively constant and high voltage gain between the frequencies of 1000 Hz and 200,000 Hz. Above and below these respective values, we observe a clear drop-off in the voltage gain. This frequency range of stable voltage gain is what is known as the bandwidth of the circuit. R.J. Smith's Circuits, Devices and Systems textbook states that the human hearing range is from 20 Hz to about 20,000 Hz. Additionally, the typical video frequency range occurs at frequencies greater than 2 million Hz. In the context of this experiment, the circuits would therefore only be suitable as an audio amplifier. This experiment could be improved by using a more advanced oscilloscope with smaller time step increments, providing more data and therefore minimizing the effect of outliers. Additionally, analyzing a larger number of frequencies would provide a more detailed frequency response, increasing the accuracy of the bandwidth. This experiment is significant because it demonstrates the foundations of real-world circuit used to generate sound amplification, something that is used by many people on a daily basis, such as me right now with my microphone. Thank you for listening to my presentation.